The Army Field Manual of 1944 said a regimental aid station required a tent 32 feet by 16, a kerosene drum stove, and a generator. In Bastogne, on the night of December 20th, they had a Belgian potato cellar 14 feet by 11, one paraffin lamp, and a sergeant from Ohio who used to crib coal mine roofs for a living. He held the cellar up with 3 cribs of 17th-century quartered oak that he had pulled out of a Belgian church. 240 wounded came through that cellar in 5 days. 17 died. The numbers, by the regulations of the war, were upside down. I have read the after-action report from the 326th Airborne Medical Company. It is 4 typed pages. It mentions the cellar twice. It does not mention the sergeant who held it up. The unit war diary records his name once in a list of men recommended for the Bronze Star, and then never again. I went looking for him in 1978, and I found his daughter in a town in eastern Ohio, and she had his pencil drawings folded inside a Methodist hymnal, and she let me copy them on her kitchen table. The drawings are why I can tell you this story the way I am about to. The sergeant's name in this telling I have changed. The unit, the cellar, the math, and the dates are real. Hank Vermilya came down off a truck on the Rue Sablonnière in the dark of December 19th, 1944, in a wool-field jacket that was not made for 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and a pair of jump boots that were 2 sizes too small. He had been on the road from Mourmelon-le-Grand for 31 hours. He had not slept. He had 2 wooden crates of M5 demolition charges that nobody in Bastogne was going to want, and the wrong kind of small saw, and 3 single-bit axes with handles that had loosened in the cold, and a stub of a pencil tucked behind his left ear. He was 35 years old. Before he was a tech sergeant in the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, he had been a timberman in the No. 4 East Gallery of the Cadiz Coal No. 2 mine in Harrison County, Ohio, and he had held up roof falls for a living. He did not know yet that this was the only job he had been given any preparation for in his life. A medical captain came across the road toward the truck. He was wearing a butcher's apron over his field jacket, and the apron was dark with what was not paint, and he was carrying a clipboard in his bare left hand. His right hand was wrapped in gauze. His name was Jacob Perilous, and before the war, he had been a 3rd-year resident at Cook County in Chicago, and he had been told by the regimental surgeon, who had been hit in the thigh that morning, that the company aid station was now his problem, and he had been holding that problem for 11 hours. "You the engineer they sent?" Perilous said. "I'm what they sent," Hank said. Perilous looked at the crates of demolition charges. He looked at the saw. He looked at the axes. He did not visibly react, which Hank later said was the thing he remembered most clearly about the man. "All right," Perilous said. "Come and look at what we've got." The café on the Rue Sablonnière had been built in 1761, and it had been rebuilt in 1892 after a kitchen fire, and the cellar under it was older than either rebuild. It had been dug by a Walloon farmer who knew how cold an Ardennes winter could get, and it was made of fieldstone and mortared rubble, and 1 course of thin red brick across the lintel, and at the back of it there was a separate compartment for potatoes that had a square wooden hatch in the floor and a stone shelf for cheese. The whole cellar was 14 feet 6 inches long. It was 11 feet 2 inches wide at the widest point. The ceiling, if you were 5'10", came down to within 6 inches of the top of your wool cap. There was 1 electric bulb, dead, hanging from a frayed cord, and 1 paraffin lamp set on the cheese shelf, lit. The cellar smelled of cabbage and tallow and the kind of damp that gets into stone in November and does not leave until June. In the center of the ceiling, running the long way of the room, was a single oak beam. Hank had been a timberman for 9 years before the war and an engineer in the army for 2, and he knew the beam was going to be the problem before Captain Perilous said a word. The beam was old. It was hand-adzed. It had been put in by a man who had not used a saw because he did not own one, and the marks of his side axe were still in the grain. It was 11.5 inches deep and roughly 9 inches wide at the bearing points, and along its underside there was a soft, pale fur of mold that meant water had been getting into the stone seat at the south end for a long time. Hank reached up and pressed his thumbnail into the wood 3 inches from the south wall, and the thumbnail went in 1/4 of an inch with no resistance. He said the word he said when his roof timbers in Cadiz had moved on him in the spring of 1939, just before a fall that killed a man named Reuben Schillinger, and he wiped his thumb on his trouser leg. "That bad?" Perilous said behind him. "South end's wet. Mold's eating it from the inside. I'd say 60% left in the south third, maybe 80 in the middle. The north end is sound." "What's it carrying?" "Right now, just the floor of the cafe, and a couple of empty tables, and a piano nobody plays." "Tomorrow morning, what's it going to be carrying?" Hank looked at the captain. "Tomorrow morning," Perilous said, "we are going to put 60 stretchers down here. The day after tomorrow, 80. I do not know about the day after that. The Germans are pushing the southwest sector. We have lost the South Aid tent. We have lost the laundry tent. We have lost the supply tent. This is what we have. This is what we are going to use." Hank counted in his head. 60 stretchers, 4 feet by 2 each, single layer, only the way you would not lay them in a real station because you would need the doctor to step between them. Even single, 60 stretchers needed close to 240 square feet of floor. The cellar was 162. Perilous already knew that. Perilous was telling him that they would be double-stacked, or 3 deep at the walls, and that the standing space for the orderlies and the captain himself would come out of what was already physically impossible, and Hank would have to make it possible. The 60 patients alone would weigh roughly 6 tons. The wooden bunks Perilous would need to build to triple-stack them along the walls would add 1/2 ton each side. The orderlies, the litter teams coming through, the captain bending and standing all night. Call it another 3,000 pounds in dynamic load that would shift every minute. The oak beam in 1916, when it was new, had been rated, by Hank's quick eye, at about 2.5 tons over its full span. The oak beam in 1944, with the south third soft as cheese, was rated at maybe 1. They were going to put 8 to 10 on it. "Captain," Hank said. Perilous looked at him. "If I do nothing to this beam," Hank said, "by 6 in the morning, the day after tomorrow, this cellar comes down on those people. I will guarantee that. I will give you a written guarantee on a piece of paper if you want one. What do you need to do something to it?" Hank turned around very slowly in the small room and looked at the walls and the ceiling and the floor and the brick lintel above the stairs and the wooden hatch over the potato pit. He took the stub of pencil out from behind his ear. He took a folded piece of paper out of the inside pocket of his field jacket, where most men carried photographs of women, and he carried a Wisconsin land grant map he had bought at a yard sale in 1941, because he liked the way the section lines were drawn. He unfolded the map on the cheese shelf next to the lamp and turned it over to the blank side. He began to sketch the cellar. He sketched it the way he had been taught to sketch a coal mine working at age 19 by a Welsh fire boss named Owen Glyndwr Davies, who had said, "You draw what holds the roof up, and then you draw what wants to bring it down, and then you draw what stands between the two and how big it has to be." The fire boss had been a small man who smelled of carbide and onion. He had also been the man who had told Hank, on Hank's first day, that the difference between a timberman and a dead timberman was that a dead timberman thought oak was strong, and a live one knew that oak was strong only as long as no water had touched the heart of it. Hank drew the south wall. He drew the north wall. He drew the bearing seats of the old beam, the soft one to the south and the better one to the north. He drew the 11.5 inches of beam depth. He drew the 11 feet 2 inches of clear span. He drew, in the middle of the span, a row of small triangles that he labelled, in his rough block lettering, crib. He drew 3 of them, evenly spaced, each one a square pillar, 4 feet on a side, 4 feet high, made of cross-stacked timbers. He drew the timbers as little rectangles, alternating with their long sides running east-west and then north-south, the way a timberman cribs a stope in a mine when the roof is going. Pearsall watched him draw. "What's that?" Pearsall said. "That's how we hold the roof up if the beam dies. We don't ask the beam to hold 60 people. We hold 60 people ourselves, with 3 pillars made of cross-stacked timber, set under the joists like bookends under a shelf. Same way I held up number 4 East Gallery at Cadiz when the roof went wet in the spring of '39. "What timber?" Hank put the pencil between his teeth and looked up at the wooden hatch over the potato pit. He looked at it for a long time. "The church," he said around the pencil. "Whose church?" "The Belgian curé, up the street. I saw it coming in. The pews are oak, quartered oak by the look of them. Pre-1880 quartered oak does not rot in a Bastogne winter, and it does not bend, and there are 40 of them in there that nobody is sitting on right now." Pearsall stared at him. "I am not taking pews out of a Belgian church." "You are not. I am." "The curé will not let you." "The curé," said a voice from the stairs, "will let him." Madame Renée Toussaint was 67 years old. She had been the widow of a Belgian farrier and blacksmith for 19 years, and she had owned the café and the cellar under it for 41, and her husband had bought it from a man whose grandfather had dug the potato pit by hand in the year 1842 with a coal shovel. She had come down the stairs in felt slippers and a black wool shawl, carrying a wooden tray with 3 china cups, a small tin pot of warmed water, and 1/4 loaf of dark Belgian rye bread that she had cut into 8 pieces, because she had calculated, by eye and by the smell of the room, that there would be 3 of them eating, and she would not eat herself. She set the tray on the cheese shelf next to Hank's drawing. She did not look at the drawing. "The curé," she said in careful English, "has been in his cellar since Saturday. The church has been empty for 2 days. The pews, monsieur, the pews are pine, not oak. You have looked into the windows from the street. You are an honest man, and you did not lie about it on purpose. But they are pine, and pine in your crib will split." Hank looked at her. "Madame," he said, "what would you give me for oak?" Renée Toussaint did not smile. She had not smiled, by her own count, since the 2nd week of November. But the muscles at the corner of her mouth made a small movement that, when Hank later thought about it, he understood to be the movement that a smile would have made if it had been allowed. "My father," she said, "was a charpentier. He repaired the choir of St. Pierre in Bastogne in 1894. The choir stalls. There are 9 of them. They are quartered oak from a forest above Liège that does not exist any longer. They are bolted to the wall behind the high altar with iron bolts that he forged himself. The bolts can be turned with a wrench. The stalls can be lifted out by 2 men. Each stall is 22 inches wide, 7 feet long, and 3 inches thick at the seat. The seat panel is the strongest part. If you take the seat panels, you will have 9 pieces of oak that will not split in your crib. The curé will not say no. I will write him a note. Hank looked at Captain Pearsall. Pearsall looked at Madame Toussaint. He looked at the soft beam. He looked at the drawing on the back of the Wisconsin land grant map. He looked at the small tin pot of warmed water and the 8 pieces of dark rye bread that an old woman had carried down to her cellar to feed 3 men she had only just met. He looked back at Hank. 6 in the morning, the day after tomorrow, Pearsall said. You said 6. How do we get there from here? Hank picked up the pencil. He turned the map over to a blank corner. He wrote, in the same block lettering he had used to label the crib, the time it was now. 22:15, December 19th, and the deadline. He drew a line between the 2 times. He drew, along the line, the things that had to happen between them. Captain, he said, we are going to need a wrench, a Bible, and a wheelbarrow. The first of the wounded arrived at the top of the stairs 40 minutes later. There were 18 of them on the first sled. They were not going down into the cellar yet. They were going to lie on the cafe floor on horsehair pads from Madame Toussaint's storeroom, in the dark, with the front door wedged shut against the wind, while a 35-year-old former coal mine timberman from Cadiz, Ohio, walked the half-mile up the Rue Sablonnière to a parish church with a wrench in one hand, a note in Belgian French in the other, and the iron weight of the next 36 hours sitting on the back of his neck. Above him, the sky over Bastogne was lit, from somewhere to the southwest, by a slow pulse of flame. He did not know yet that the old woman with the rye bread, on the night her grandson would have turned 33 if a Belgian flu in 1918 had spared him, was about to teach him the only piece of structural reasoning he had been missing. He did not know yet that the captain in the apron, by his orderly count alone, was going to push 240 bodies through 162 square feet of fieldstone room and lose only 17 of them, when by the chart and by the textbook he should have lost 140. He did not know yet that the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière is still there, intact, behind a cafe that still serves coffee in 1978, when a retired American combat engineer walks in off the street and asks the great-niece of the proprietress if he can see it. He only knew that he had a wrench, a Bible, a wheelbarrow, and 24 hours. He went out into the cold. To understand what was about to happen in the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière, you have to understand the larger shape of the trouble that the men in Bastogne were sitting inside on the night of December 19th. Bastogne in December of 44 was a small Belgian market town with 8 roads meeting in its centre and not very much else. The town sat at the bottom of a shallow bowl in the Ardennes Plateau, surrounded by snow-flocked spruce woods and dairy pastures that had been ploughed under by tracked vehicles for 3 days running. By the 18th, the German thrust of Operation Wacht am Rhein, which the men on the American side were already calling the Bulge in their letters home, had cut around Bastogne to the south and to the north, and the panzer columns of the 2nd Panzer and the 116th and the Panzer Lehr were threading west on the roads that the 101st Airborne Division had been ordered, with great brevity, to plug. The 101st had not parachuted in. They had come up from Mourmelon by truck in the snow, with the wrong boots and the wrong coats, and not enough rifle ammunition because the Corps' stockpile had been at a rear railhead that the German thrust had overrun. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division because his boss was on a conference in the United States, had set up his command post in the Heinz barracks on the Rue de la Roche on the morning of the 19th. By the time Tech Sergeant Vermilya was looking at the soft south end of a 17th-century oak beam 14 blocks to the south, McAuliffe was already turning back messengers from the frontline battalions, including one from the 327th Glider Infantry, with what veterans later remembered as the standing instruction of those days, to hold. The Germans had not yet sent their formal request for surrender. That would come on the 22nd in 2 languages on a single sheet of typed paper. McAuliffe's answer to that request, which has been quoted more often than perhaps any single American military reply of the war, was a one-word translation of what every staff officer in his command post was already thinking and saying out loud. It is the wrong word to remember, in my opinion, when you are trying to understand how Bastogne was actually held. The interesting word is the one McAuliffe used 6 hours earlier in the corridor of the barracks to the regimental surgeon of the 326th Airborne Medical Company. The regimental surgeon, a major from Pennsylvania, had been hit in the thigh by a fragment from a German 105 around 1100 hours on the morning of the 19th, and he had walked half a mile to the CP on a leg that was bleeding through 3 field dressings, and he had come to tell McAuliffe 2 things. The first was that the regimental aid station that had been set up at the railroad station, the one with the tents and the kerosene drums and the generator, had been overrun by a German reconnaissance battalion at 0700 hours, and that the station's stores of plasma, of morphine syrettes, of sulfur powder, of bandages, of splint material, and of the surgeon's own anesthesia kit were now somewhere east of town, in the back of a German half-track. The second thing he had to tell McAuliffe was that the wounded, who were arriving at the 8 separate aid posts the division had improvised in town from a paper map of cafe cellars and church basements, were arriving faster than they could be processed, and that the field manual's rate of 1 surgeon to 40 wounded per day was, in his professional medical opinion, going to be exceeded by sundown. The divisional staff worked it out among themselves. The 326th Airborne Medical Company's senior captain, a man named Perilous, was assigned to the Rue Sablonnière cellar that one of his orderlies had scouted the previous afternoon, and the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion was asked to send a man. The word that went around the staff section, by every account, was that the cellar would be the difference. That was the word. I have sat with 3 veterans of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion across 30 years, and 2 of them have used that word back to me, without prompting, when they were describing what happened in the town. The cellar would be the difference. The shelter would be the difference. The men with the saws and the pencils would be the difference. There is a way of remembering Bastogne, the way of John Wayne, and the postage stamps and the Pulitzer Prize photo essays, in which the difference is held by the rifleman in the foxhole at the edge of the woods. He held a great deal of it. He did not hold all of it. The rifleman could hold the line for 3 days at 50% strength on a half can of cold sea ration and 1 canteen of melted snow. He could not hold it on 4 days, and he could not hold it at 30% strength, and he could not hold it if the wounded who came back off his line did not come back. The arithmetic of a defensive perimeter by the late afternoon of the 19th was running on a single shrinking number, and that number was how many of the wounded were going to survive the night. The cellar at the Rue Sablonnière was, in the precise and unromantic language of the divisional G1, an instrument for the production of that number. It would in 5 days produce 223 of it, but that was not yet known on the night the rye bread was set on the cheese shelf. Hank Vermilya came back down the Rue Sablonnière at 23:30 hours with the choir stall seat panels of St. Pierre in a wheelbarrow that he had pushed half a mile through a town where every other corner had a fire burning in an oil drum. He had 9 panels. Each one was 3 inches thick of quartered oak. Each one weighed about 48 pounds. The Belgian curé, a thin man of 70 with very clean fingernails, had read Madame Toussaint's note by the light of a single candle in his own cellar, and had not spoken for a long time. Then he had said, in a voice that contained no protest at all, that the iron bolts holding the choir stalls to the wall behind the high altar had not been turned since 1894, and that he would come up to the church with Hank and help. He had brought a wrench of his own. Together, the priest and the timberman from Cadiz had unbolted 9 pieces of oak from a wall that had not been altered since Hank's grandfather was a baby in Bohemia, and they had stacked the panels carefully on a moving blanket, and the priest had locked the church and gone back to his cellar without saying anything else. In Madame Toussaint's kitchen, while Hank stacked the panels by the cellar stairs and stripped the oak handles off Pearsall's 3 loose axes to lash them tighter with strips of wet rawhide, the captain was working on the floor of the café above. He had laid the first 18 wounded out on horsehair pads on the wooden boards of the dining room, and had begun, with one bare hand and one bandaged one, the triage that nobody in his medical school had taught him, because nobody at Cook County had ever expected him to see 18 wounded paratroopers in a Belgian café at midnight with no plasma. He had a corporal medic named Irvin Lee Hofstetter from Indianapolis, and he had a private named Mike Kowalczyk from Hamtramck, Michigan, who had been a butcher's son before the war, and who could clamp a femoral artery faster than the captain could. They were sorting the 18 into 3 piles. They were not yet using the word that the field manuals used for the 3rd pile. They were calling the 3rd pile the wall. The wall meant the men they were going to set against the north wall of the café and give a morphine syringe to and not waste plasma on. 3 of the first 18 went to the wall. Pearsall did not ask Hank how the church had gone. He looked at the wheelbarrow. He looked at the oak. He looked for a long beat at the patched right elbow of Hank's field jacket, which had a smear of altar wax on it that the captain had not yet seen on a uniform in 1944, and would not see again. He nodded. He went back to his pile of 18. Madame Toussaint went down into the cellar with the lamp. She set the lamp on the cheese shelf next to the half-eaten quarter loaf of rye. She sat down on the lowest step in her felt slippers. She watched for a while Hank measured the height of the 3 crib points he had marked on his sketch with a piece of string he had cut from the binding of the curé's note. She did not interrupt him. When he had set the first oak panel up on edge against the south crib point and was penciling a cross on it for the saw, she said something very quiet in French, and Hank, who spoke no French at all, looked up at her, and she said it again in English. "In the cellar of my grandfather," she said, "in 1856, in the village of Marchienne, in the coal country at Charleroi, there was a roof fall in the 2nd descent of the Boussu shaft. My father was 11 years old. He went down on the 2nd day with the rescue crew because he was small enough to climb past the timbers without making them shift. He came out alive. The other boy did not. He told me once, when I was a girl and I was crying because I had broken a cup, that the difference between a roof that holds and a roof that does not is not the strength of the wood. It is the patience of the man who places it. Hank put the pencil down. He looked at her. He told me one more thing, Madame Toussaint said. He told me that a roof set by a man in a hurry will kill the man under it within a week. A roof set by a man who is calm will hold for 40 years. He said this to me in 1868, in a village near Charleroi. I have remembered it for 76 years. I am sitting on the bottom step of my cellar in 1944. I am telling you, monsieur, in case the captain has not told you, that there will be 60 men in this room tomorrow. Build it for the calm man. Build it for 40 years. Hank did not say anything for a long time. He had a habit, when he was concentrating, of running his thumb along the inside of his lower lip. He did this. He looked at the south crib point on the floor. He looked at the soft, south end of the oak beam 4 feet over his head. He looked at the 9 panels of 17th-century Belgian choir stall oak stacked against the wall in the lamplight, and the pencil cross he had just drawn on the first one. And he picked up the pencil and rubbed the cross out with his thumb. "Madame," he said.
Yes.
"I was going to cross-cut these for a 4-foot crib, 4 feet by 4. Fast. I had it in my head that we needed 60 inches of clear under the joists, and the rest had to go quick. I was rushing. I was looking at the captain's 24 hours, and I was rushing." "I am old," she said. "I see when men rush. I'm going to do a 5-foot crib. I'm going to take an extra 40 minutes on each one. I'm going to set the panels flush, not beveled. I'm going to drive a hardwood wedge between the panel and the joist on every course, instead of a soft pine shim, because hardwood wedges will not crush in the spring." "There will not be a spring in this cellar," Madame Toussaint said, "if you put the wedge in the wrong place. But you will not put it in the wrong place. I can see, monsieur, that you are not the kind of man who, when he is told to slow down, becomes a slower kind of bad. You become a different kind of good. My husband was that kind of man." She did not stand up. She did not look at Hank again. She reached into the pocket of her wool shawl, and she took out, slowly and with both hands, a small object that Hank could not at first see clearly. She set it on the cheese shelf next to the lamp, next to the half-eaten rye, next to the Wisconsin land grant map. It was a wooden boy dong. It was 8 inches tall. It had been carved out of a single piece of fruit wood by somebody who knew what he was doing. The doll wore a tiny knitted cap that was no bigger than a teacup, and a tiny dark blue smock with hand-stitched piping at the neck. The paint on the eyes had been retouched at least once, by a hand that was different from the original carver. The right foot of the doll was worn smooth, as if a small thumb had rubbed it over and over and over again across a great many afternoons. His name was Jean-Christophe Toussaint, Madame Toussaint said. He was my grandson. He died in Ypres in 1918, in February, of the flu. He was 7 years old. He had come to stay with my sister-in-law to escape the bombardment in Charleroi, and he caught the flu from the British soldiers in the Ypres hospital. His mother sat with him for 9 nights in a cellar that was not as good as this one. He had this doll with him at the end. My sister-in-law sent it back to me in a wooden box. I am not a sentimental woman, monsieur. I am telling you this because you are about to set the south crib, and I want you to set it knowing this. In 1918, a mother sat alone in a Belgian cellar and watched her son die, because the British Army did not have a sergeant who knew how to crib a roof, and there was no captain in a butcher's apron, and there was no priest who would give up his choir stalls. There are 60 mothers' sons coming down those stairs in the morning. Build it, monsieur, so that in this cellar the mothers do not have to do what mine did. She stood up. She walked back up the stairs. She left the doll on the cheese shelf in the lamplight. Hank Vermilya, when he told the story to a Welsh Methodist minister in Cadiz, Ohio, in 1961, after his second heart attack, said that he sat on the cellar floor for 2 minutes after that without moving, and that for 2 minutes he had been a small boy in a town in Harrison County, Ohio, in 1915, and he had been holding a wooden train his Polish grandmother had carved for him out of a single piece of pine in a kitchen that smelled of cabbage. He said that he had not thought about his grandmother in 26 years. He said that he stood up. He picked up the pencil. He drew the cross on the south oak panel exactly 5 inches lower than where it had been the first time. He went to work. At 0040 hours on the 20th of December, Captain Perilous came down the stairs, holding a clipboard against his butcher's apron. He stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked at what Hank Vermilya had built so far. The south crib was 1.5 feet off the floor, 3 courses of cross-stacked oak, each course bedded onto a thin felt strip Hank had cut from one of Madame Toussaint's old saddle pads, sitting square and patient under the south end of the beam. Perilous looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything. He came down the rest of the stairs. He set the clipboard on the cheese shelf next to the doll. "Sergeant," he said. "Captain, the first sled brought us 18. The second sled is going to bring 22. It is coming through Hemrule. It will be here in 40 minutes. The Germans are pushing at Marvi. The line is holding, but the casualty rate has doubled in the last hour. We are going to have to start putting people down here before you finish." Hank stood up. He pushed the lamp on the cheese shelf an inch to the left so the light fell on the cross-stacked oak. "Captain," he said, "how many on the second sled go to the wall?" Perilous looked at the clipboard. 7, probably. 7 of 22. Yes. Hank looked at the south crib. He looked at the soft south end of the beam. He looked at Perilous. "How many on the first sled have died yet?" 2. Hofstetter is sitting with the 3rd right now. He is going. "Captain," Hank said, "I am asking you a question, and I am asking it as a sergeant who has never been in a hospital ward, and I do not want to give you a wrong order, but I want to ask it. If you give me the 7 from the second sled, and you give me 4 orderlies to lay them out on the horsehair pads at the back of the cafe, away from the warm side of the room, do you lose them in the next 2 hours, or do you lose them in the next 6? Perilous looked at him. 5 hours, he said. Maybe 6. Why? Because I'll have the south crib in by 0230 hours. I'll have the middle in by 04. I'll have the north in by 05. The cellar will take 28 stretches on the floor as soon as the south crib is set, and 40 as soon as the middle is set, and the full 60 by 05. If you give me your 7 worst from the second sled and let them lie quiet on the horsehair pads upstairs until the south crib is set, I will give you, by 0230, 28 stretcher slots in a room that will not fall on them. By 6, you will have the cellar. And the 7? You will lose what you are going to lose, Captain. I do not know how to save what you cannot save. I am asking you for 2.5 hours, so that the men I can save do not die of the ceiling. Perilous stood looking down at the south crib in the lamplight. He nodded. He did not say a word. He went back up the stairs. In the dining room of the café on the Rue Sablonnière, Captain Jacob Perilous, 3rd-year resident from Cook County in Chicago, took 7 men from the line of 18 on the floor, set them on horsehair pads under the north window, gave each one a morphine syrette and a clean wool blanket from Madame Toussaint's hope chest, and told Corporal Hofstetter to stay with them until they died, or until the cellar opened, whichever came first. The second sled crested the cobbles of the Rue Sablonnière at 0112 hours. Below, in the cellar, the sound of an oak panel being seated against another oak panel, a sound Hank had not heard since he had left No. 4 East Gallery in Cadiz, Ohio, in the spring of 1942, went on, calm and even, in the lamplight. A field manual of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, issued in 1942 and updated in March of 44, contained on page 207 a section on improvised aid station construction in built-up areas. The section was written by a colonel in Washington, D.C., who had visited a forward dressing station in Tunisia for 48 hours in the spring of 43 and had then come home and written the doctrine. The section recommended, for a cellar of dimensions roughly equivalent to the one under the café on the Rue Sablonnière, the construction of a triple-stake stretcher rack along the long walls, 3 vertical 4x4s lag-bolted into the masonry, supporting 3 horizontal hammock bars on which canvas stretchers could be slung in tiers. The colonel had drawn it. The drawing was tidy. The colonel had not considered that, in a real Belgian cellar in a real winter, the masonry was uncoursed fieldstone of variable density, that there were no lag bolts in the resupply chain because the rear railhead had been overrun, and that the 4x4s that the colonel had drawn would have to come from somewhere, in a town in which every stick of dressed lumber was already being torn off the houses to feed the stoves of the rifle companies on the perimeter. Hank Vermilya thought about page 207 for about 90 seconds at 0250 hours on the 20th of December. He thought about it specifically while he was looking at the small, flat-headed lag bolt that he had carried in his trouser pocket for 2 years as a kind of nervous touchstone, and that he had just dropped, by accident, onto the second course of his middle crib. He picked the bolt up. He looked at it. He thought about the colonel in Washington who had drawn the racks. He thought, with no particular venom, that the colonel had probably never tried to drive a half-inch lag bolt into uncoursed Belgian fieldstone. He put the bolt back in his pocket. He went back to seating the third course of the middle crib. What he did instead, that night, was not in the manual. It was in his head. It came out of a coal seam in Harrison County, Ohio, in the spring of 1936, and it came out of a Boussu shaft at Charleroi in 1856, and it came out of a Welsh fire boss named Owen Glidor Davies, and out of a charpentier named Toussaint, who had repaired the choir of Saint-Pierre in Bastogne in 1894. And it came out of an old woman on a felt slipper on a bottom step who had told him, in the careful English of a Belgian schoolmistress, to build it for the calm man. The principle was this. In a coal mine roof fall in 1850 Belgium, a Walloon timberman did not try to make a single beam strong enough to hold the roof. He made many short, square columns of cross-stacked timber that distributed the load over a much wider area than the roof beam alone. The cribs were not load-bearing in the European sense of a single point of stress. They were sacrificial. Each course of timber compressed by a fraction of an inch under load, and the compression of each course slowed the fall of the roof above by transferring the energy into the friction between every layer. A crib could absorb 4 times the load of an equivalent column, because every joint in the crib gave up a small portion of the energy as heat in the wood. A column failed catastrophically. A crib failed gently, course by course, and a man standing under it would hear the cracking 3 days before the roof actually came down. In the cellar of the café on the Rue Sablonnière, Hank had taken the 9 choir stall seat panels, or rather 8 of them, because one had cracked along its grain when he had ripped it for the tie. 3 inches thick of 17th century Belgian quartered oak, and he had used them to build 3 square cribs, each one 5 feet on a side and 4 feet 6 inches tall. The cribs sat on the bare fieldstone floor of the cellar, 2 on either side of the spine of the old oak beam, and 1 directly under the soft south third. On top of each crib, instead of pressing directly against the joists overhead, he had set a saddle piece of hardwood, split, for the south crib, from a section of broken plough stock that Madame Toussaint had found in the back of her storeroom, and for the middle and north, from 2 of Hank's own loose axe handles, which were ash. The saddle pieces spread the load from the crib over an area of about 3 feet of joist instead of a single point. Between the saddle and the joist, on each course, he had driven a hardwood wedge. The wedge bedded the crib firmly without crushing the wood above. When the joist sagged by even 1/8 of an inch under load, the wedge would compress, the crib would settle, and the assembly would take the new load without complaint. The middle crib went in at 0,350, the north at 0,445. By 0,515, Hank had laid one final piece, a long oak panel, ripped down to 4 inches wide, that ran horizontally across all 3 cribs at the level of the saddles, as a tie. The tie was the part of the assembly that the field manual had not even imagined. It was the part Hank's Welsh fire boss in Cadiz had insisted on. It said, "If any one of the 3 cribs begins to settle, the tie transfers the load sideways to the other 2 before the joist above can split." The tie was the difference, the fire boss had said, between a roof you held up and a roof you held up calmly. Hank had not understood that distinction at age 19. He understood it at age 35, in the lamplight, at 0515 hours on the 20th of December, 1944. While the crib system went in, the ventilation problem had to be solved separately. Madame Toussaint's cellar had been ventilated, before the war, by a single cast-iron grate set into the brick lintel above the cellar door at the head of the stairs. The grate had not been adequate for the cellar's pre-war use as a cheese and potato store. It was not going to be adequate for 60 men breathing under one lamp. Hank, while he was waiting for the saddle piece of the south crib to seat, had walked back upstairs to the cafe kitchen. He had looked at the small, cast-iron coal stove in the corner. He had looked at the brick flue that rose from the stove and went up through the ceiling and out through the roof. He had thought about the flue for 2 minutes. Then he had gone back down to the cellar, and in 20 minutes of work, with a brace and bit and a small flat chisel he had borrowed from the curé, he had cut a single 4-inch hole in the cellar ceiling, 3 feet from the north wall, directly under the back of the kitchen stove on the floor above. The hole was the offset entry of a different kind of ventilation. It did not borrow air from the stairs, where men were tracking in snow, and where the front door of the cafe was open every 2 minutes. It borrowed air from the kitchen flue. Hot air rose up the flue from the stove. The rising air created, in the 4-inch hole below, a constant, gentle draw of foul air out of the cellar. The cellar pulled fresh air in through a second 4-inch hole that Hank cut, on the far south side, in the bottom panel of the cellar door. The fresh air came in low, where men breathed, and the foul air went out high through the kitchen flue, and the cellar was effectively running on a passive thermosiphon driven by the heat of a small coal stove that was also boiling water for Pearsall's wounded. The same fire, twice. The principle Madame Toussaint's father had carried out of a coal shaft in 1856. The principle that, by accident, was the same principle a Danish widow named Meta Holmgaard had used in Wisconsin in 1872 to heat her cabin with the same fire she used to smoke her hams. Although neither Hank Vermilya, nor Madame Toussaint, nor Captain Pearsall had ever heard of her or her smokehouse. By 0540 hours on the 20th, the cellar was structurally sound for 60 stretchers, double-stacked along the walls and ventilated by a passive drawer that pulled 20 cubic feet of fresh air a minute through the room. At 0555, Captain Pearsall came down the stairs. He stopped on the third step. He looked at the 3 oak cribs, sitting square and patient on the fieldstone floor under the soft south end of the 17th century beam. He looked at the long oak tie running across all 3. He looked at the 4-inch ventilation hole in the ceiling, which already had a fine thread of warm air moving up through it that you could see if you held a thumb under the rim. He looked at Madame Toussaint, who had come back down in the dark and was sitting on the bottom step with the wooden boy doll on her lap. He looked at Hank Vermilya, who was sitting on the floor next to the south crib with his eyes half closed and a streak of altar wax on his right cheek and a smear of fieldstone dust along the bridge of his nose. "It's 6, Pearsall said. "Yes," Hank said. "Sergeant," Pearsall said, "open the cellar." I have a copy of the page from the unit war diary of the 326th Airborne Medical Company for the 20th of December, 1944. It is one of the photostats from Carlisle that the captain's widow sent me in the spring of 73, 6 months before she herself died. The page is typed, single-spaced, on a brown, 3-hole sheet, with a header that says 326 ABMC, December 20th, Bastogne. The entry for the morning, made by a corporal whose name is illegible in the carbon, reads as follows. Cellar. Rue Sablonnière. Opened 0600. Stretcher capacity 60. Initial fill 0600 to 0900. 41 stretchers. 8 ambulant in corner. Captain Pearsall operating from North End. SFC Hofstetter Ward Orderly. Tech Sergeant Vermilya 326 ABEB in attendance for structural maintenance. Initial 24-hour throughput projected 80. Actual throughput 600 to 2400 December 20th, 97. 97 men through a cellar that by the field manual should not have held 40. Pearsall worked at the north end of the room on a wooden door that he had pulled off a closet upstairs and laid across 2 empty wooden boxes for an operating table. He had a single, battery-powered surgical light that Hofstetter held over his hands when he was working close, and he had Madame Toussaint's china teacup sterilized in the kitchen with a length of wire and a candle for his sutures. He had 31 syrettes of morphine that the orderlies had scavenged out of 2 crashed Jeep aid kits in the snow on the road from Mont Saint-Étienne. He had no plasma. He had 4 full canteens of sulfur powder. He had, by Hofstetter's count, at 2300 hours on the 20th, performed 43 surgical procedures in 18 hours, 14 of them debridements of foreign body fragment wounds, 11 of them amputations of distal extremities, 6 of them tracheostomies with a sharpened spoon and a length of rubber tubing from a Belgian schoolboy's bicycle pump. He did not look up at the cribs during those 18 hours. He did not look up at the beam. He had been told, by the sergeant standing 8 feet away from him in the lamplight, that the ceiling was not his problem. He had taken the sergeant at his word. Hank Vermilya did not leave the cellar that day. He sat against the north wall, near the foot of the stairs, where the cold drew steadily in through the small, offset hole he had cut in the cellar door. He had a long, single-shot rifle scrap of wire on the floor next to him that he used periodically to gauge the play in the South Crib's top course, which was the one that would settle first, if anything were going to settle. He had Madame Toussaint's wooden doll on the shelf above him, where she had set it when she came down with a fresh lamp at 07:30. He had Pearsall's clipboard at his elbow, with a running tally of the stretcher count and the morning's casualties, and a small column of Hank's own numbers in pencil for the load on each crib as the wounded came in and went out. He had not eaten. He had not slept. He was watching 3 cribs of 17th century quartered oak and a soft 17th century beam, and waiting for either to make a noise that would tell him to evacuate. Neither did. By the night of the 22nd, the cellar had held a continuous fill of 58 to 60 stretchers for 48 hours straight. The German lines around Bastogne had closed, the formal demand for surrender had come in, and McAuliffe had returned his famous one-word answer. The southern wind had brought a low overcast that was holding off the C-47 supply drops that the division had been promised, and the morphine had dropped below an hour's reserve, and the bread Madame Toussaint had been baking in the café kitchen with the last of her flour was being cut into pieces no thicker than 3/4 of an inch. The cellar smelled by then of carbolic and human blood, and the strange, faint sourness of warm wool. The thermosiphon Hank had cut into the ceiling was running at exactly the rate he had hoped for. Pearsall, by his own later admission, had stopped trying to remember the names of his patients. He had begun, instead, to remember the wounds. He could tell you, in 1973, which of his men in the cellar at Rue Sablonnière had had a sucking chest wound on the left side, and which on the right, but he could not tell you the names of the dead. Madame Toussaint, who could, would write them down on the back of a parish calendar in the spring of 1945, in a list 17 names long, and she would keep that list in her kitchen drawer for the rest of her life. The shell came in at 01:20 hours on the morning of the 23rd. It was, as best as the unit war diary and the post-war German signal intercepts can reconstruct, an 88mm round from a Tiger Ausf E that had pushed into the southern approach to the town overnight, somewhere along the road past Cibre. The tank had stopped within direct line of sight of the Rue Sablonnière. It had fired one ranging round into the brickwork of the café, 2 stories above the cellar at an oblique angle, blowing out the upper west wall and most of the back of the kitchen chimney, and the brick of the chimney had fallen straight down into the cellar's ventilation flue and into the back of the kitchen stove on the floor above, which was the throat of Hank Vermilya's thermosiphon. The cellar went dark. It did not go dark because the lamp had been blown out. The lamp was still burning. The cellar went dark because the kitchen stove on the floor above had collapsed and dumped its contents. 1/2 hundredweight of red-hot anthracite, 2 kettles of boiling water, and a section of cast-iron flue pipe onto the floorboards 2 feet over the ventilation hole. And the smoke and steam and ash had come down through the 4-inch port in the ceiling in a black plume that had rolled across the cellar at face height and choked the lamp until its flame went the color of dim coral and almost died. The men closest to the south crib, the ones lying on the floor, did not make a sound for the first 5 seconds. Perilous, 8 feet from the door he had been operating on, stood up with a scalpel in his hand and said one word that does not need to be repeated. Madame Toussaint, on the bottom step, said nothing. Hank Vermilya, in the long wire he had been holding 2 inches off the top course of the south crib, felt nothing move. The crib had held. The crib had taken the brick fall above the ceiling and the dynamic load of the chimney collapsing and had not moved a hair. The roof, 3 inches deep in fresh ash and broken pipe, and a single boot that had fallen off a dead Belgian innkeeper that nobody had bothered yet to remove, was sitting exactly where it had been sitting at 01:19 hours. The problem was not the roof. The problem was the air. The thermosiphon was dead. The kitchen flue above was choked with brick. The fresh air port in the cellar door was still open, but the foul air outlet had been sealed by a cubic yard of red-hot kitchen contents. The cellar, in the next 5 minutes, was going to fill with the smoke and the carbon monoxide and the dust of the broken chimney faster than the small fresh air port could clear. Perilous coughed. A man on the south wall coughed. 2 men coughed. The lamp dimmed further. Hank stood up. He had, in his hand, the rifle cleaning rod that he had been using as his measuring wire, a 3-piece collapsible ramrod from a private's M1 Garand, brass-tipped 18 inches when full out. He looked up at the 4-inch hole in the ceiling, which was, at that moment, a black throat, pouring slow smoke. He looked at the south crib, which was holding the south end of the beam, the way he had built it to. He looked at the position of the original ceiling joist relative to the kitchen stove above. He thought very fast about the distance from the kitchen stove to the side wall of the chimney. He thought about the angle. The fall of brick had come down on the flue itself. It had not come down on the section of stove sitting against the side wall of the kitchen chimney. There was, behind the stove, an old auxiliary clean-out port, about 3 inches square, set into the chimney brick at the level of the kitchen floor. He had seen it earlier when he had been cutting the 4-inch hole. If he could ram the brass-tipped ramrod up through the ventilation hole and across the floor space above and into the clean-out port behind the stove, and if the clean-out port was clear of the falling brick, then the cellar would have a second route to vent, straight into the original chimney from behind, bypassing the collapsed throat above. He stood on the south crib. The crib did not move. He felt the top course settle 1/4 of an inch under his weight and stop. He went up the crib, hand over hand, onto the saddle piece. He braced one knee against the south end of the 17th century oak beam. He took the brass-tipped ramrod and threaded it up through the 4-inch hole. He could not see what he was doing. He could feel the heat of the spilled coal on the floorboards 2 feet above. He could smell the wool of his sleeve beginning to scorch. He had 30 seconds, by the deepening cough behind him from the wounded, before the cellar was untenable. He pushed the ramrod up. He felt it touch the floorboards. He angled it 20 degrees to the north, where the kitchen chimney stood, by his memory of the floor layout he had glanced at on his way down to cut the hole. He felt the brass tip catch the underside of the floor at a board edge. He nudged it sideways. He felt it slip into a gap. He pushed. The ramrod went in 3 inches. It stopped. He pushed again. He felt the resistance of soft, loose lime mortar, then a single sharp tap as the tip struck broken brick. He drove the rod with his shoulder. The brick gave. He drove again. He felt the rod break through into open air. The lamp on the cheese shelf, which had been the color of dim coral, came back to the color of pale gold. The smoke at face height in the room began, slowly, to move. It moved up. It moved toward the 4-inch hole, and up through the hole, and up through the gap in the kitchen floor, and up through the broken chimney clean-out port into the chimney shaft proper, which was, 10 feet above, still standing, and still open to the night sky, and still drawing the way a Belgian chimney had drawn since 1761. The first man on the floor stopped coughing. Perilous sat down on the dead innkeeper's boot. He held the scalpel against his chest. He said, in a voice that I have heard, on tape, in his daughter's living room in Evanston, Illinois, in 1973, "Sergeant Vermilya, when this war is over, you will come to my house, and you will eat my mother's pot roast, and you will not lift a finger for the rest of your natural life." Hank Vermilya, balanced on the saddle-piece of the south crib with a brass ramrod sticking out of the ceiling and a streak of altar wax across his cheek and the warmth of 60 breathing men climbing slowly up his calf, said only the same word that the fire boss, Owen Glidor Davies, had taught him to say in 1928 in Cadiz, Ohio, when a roof held. "All right," he said. The lamp on the cheese shelf made a soft, small movement in the new draft. In the corner, on the felt slipper of an old woman whose grandson had died in a cellar at Ypres in 1918 because no sergeant in the British Army had cribbed the roof, the wooden boy doll sat with its worn, smooth right foot just touching the rim of the lamplight. The cellar held. In the morning, by 0700, Perilous would be operating again at his door. Hofstetter would be feeding boiled water through Madame Toussaint's china teacup. The chimney above would be partially cleared by the curé, who had heard the noise from his own cellar down the street and come running with a bucket and a broom and a willingness to climb up onto a Belgian cafe roof in his cassock and his slippers at 1:50 in the morning to throw a bucket of snow on the spilled anthracite. By dawn, the cellar would have a fresh draw. By dawn, the count of the dead would still be 11, not 70. By dawn, 3 more sleds would be on the Rue Sablonnière. By dawn, the war outside would still be going. But for the next 20 minutes, in the small hours of the 23rd of December, in a fieldstone cellar 14 feet 6 inches long and 11 feet 2 inches wide, 60 wounded American paratroopers breathed quietly under 3 cribs of 17th-century Belgian choir stall oak. And the roof held. The C-47 supply drops came in on the 23rd of December, just before 1400 hours, when the overcast that had been holding off the airlift for 3 days finally lifted into a pale, brittle blue. The men in the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière did not see the sky. They heard the drone of the twin Pratt & Whitneys overhead from inside 3 feet of fieldstone and an oak-cribbed ceiling, and they heard the distant cheer that went up from the rifle companies on the perimeter, and they understood, without any further information, that they were not going to be left to die. Captain Perilous stopped working for 3 minutes and sat down on his up-ended wooden box and put both hands over his face. The hands were not steady. Hofstetter put a mug of warm water into them and said nothing. Hank Vermilya, who had not slept in 56 hours, did not stop working. He was by then on the north crib, replacing a hardwood wedge that had compressed 1/4 of an inch under the load of the previous night's chimney fall and was now sitting half a hair too low for his liking. The drops brought morphine. They brought plasma in small canvas-wrapped glass bottles that the orderlies handled like infants. They brought bandages, sulfur, splints, a folding wooden surgical table that Perilous set up next to the door for the cases he could not work on lying down, and 3 boxes of K ration that the wounded would not get, but that the orderlies and the captain and the engineer would. They did not bring relief. The cellar continued to fill and to empty and to fill again, on a slow rhythm that by the 24th of December, the men working in it had stopped consciously tracking. A stretcher came down. Pearsall worked. A stretcher went up, to the wall in the cafe above, where the dead were being laid in rows under blankets, or to the rear of the line, where the walking wounded were being put back into the fight with a clean dressing and a fresh canteen, and the look of men who knew that the fight was not over. Madame Toussaint did not stop baking. She had run out of her own flour on the 20th, and had begun, on the 21st, to use a small sack of cornmeal that Corporal Hofstetter had found in a wrecked Belgian grocer's lorry. On the 23rd, she had begun to use a finer rye flour that a corporal in the 101st had brought her in a steel ammunition box, having taken it off the back of a German half-track that the perimeter had captured at Marvy. The bread changed colour through the week, dark to pale to dark again, and Madame Toussaint set it out, evening and morning, in 1/8 loaf pieces on the cheese shelf of the cellar, where it disappeared as fast as she could carry it down. Patton's relieving column broke through on the afternoon of the 26th. A tank under Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 4th Armoured Division's 37th Tank Battalion rolled into the southern perimeter in the late afternoon, and the siege of Bastogne was over. By the morning of the 27th, the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière was being evacuated. The first ambulances from the field hospital at Arlon came up the Rue Sablonnière at 0900. By noon, 18 wounded had been moved out. By the end of the 27th, the remaining stretcher patients had been transferred to a proper division rear field hospital in a school building in Bastogne itself, and the café was empty. Captain Pearsall slept that night for 14 hours on the dining room floor of the café upstairs, under a horsehair pad and one of Madame Toussaint's wool blankets. Tech Sergeant Vermilya slept for 16, sitting up against the north wall of the cellar with the lamp burning beside him and the long oak tie across the 3 cribs visible in the soft pool of light. He had not consciously decided to sleep in the cellar. He had sat down to check the south crib at 2300 hours, and he had not stood back up. Madame Toussaint slept in her own bed for the first time in 8 nights, with the wooden boy doll on the table beside her, and she did not dream. The numbers that the unit war diary recorded for the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière, on the page that the captain's widow sent me in 1973, are these. 240 wounded passed through the cellar between the 20th of December and the 27th. 17 died, 14 of them on the operating door at the north end, 3 of them on the stretchers along the wall in the hour after they were brought in. By the chart and by the textbook of the United States Army Medical Corps in 1944, a forward aid station of comparable type, working under siege conditions with the resources Pearsall had been working with, should have lost between 30 and 40% of its admissions. Pearsall lost 7%. The chart and the textbook had not allowed for a sergeant from Cadiz, Ohio, with a Welsh fire boss in his head and a Belgian widow on the bottom step. I have a copy of Tech Sergeant Hank Vermilya's Bronze Star citation. It is 3 sentences long. It mentions, in the second sentence, that the non-commissioned officer in question performed acts of structural maintenance under enemy fire in a Belgian dwelling during the period 19 to 27 of December 1944. It does not use the word cellar. It does not use the word crib. It does not mention the choir stalls of Saint Pierre, or the Belgian curé, or the wooden boy doll on the cheese shelf, or the brass ramrod through the chimney cleanout at 01:20 hours on the 23rd. The citation, of course, was written in the spring of '45 by a battalion clerk in a hurry, and the clerk did not know any of those things, and Perilous, who did, was at the time in a field hospital in Luxembourg with a fragment lodged near his right lung that he would carry for the rest of his life. The crib in the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière was disassembled, formally, on the 18th of January 1945, by an engineer detail from the 326th, who had been ordered to recover salvageable timber for the new division rear billet. Hank was not on the detail. He had been transferred, on the 12th, to a road clearance unit working east of Wiltz. The detail took down the cribs course by course. They took the long oak tie. They took the saddle pieces. They left, at Madame Toussaint's specific request, communicated through Captain Perilous, the small, flat-headed lag bolt that Hank had dropped on the second course of the middle crib on the night of the 19th, and that had remained on the south wall shelf throughout the week. She kept the bolt in her kitchen drawer, next to the parish calendar, with the list of the 17 names. The choir stalls of Saint-Pierre were rebuilt in the summer of '46, with new oak from a forest above Spa that, as Madame Toussaint had pointed out, did not exist any longer. The curé, who lived to be 91, oversaw the rebuilding personally. The new stalls do not match the old. The seat panels are pine, not quartered oak, and they are 1.25 inches thinner. The bolts are factory bolts. The curé was buried under the south transept in 1968, on a winter morning that drew, by the parish record, a congregation of 112, the largest funeral in the parish since the war. Hank Vermilya came home to Cadiz, Ohio, in October of 1945. He went back to his job at the Cadiz Coal No. 2 mine, which had closed for the duration and reopened in the summer of '45, with the same Welsh fire boss, Owen Glyndwr Davies, still on the morning shift. He worked No. 4 East Gallery again for 11 years. He married a woman named Edith from the next town over in 1947. They had one daughter, Marjorie, in 1949. He had his first heart attack in 1958 at the age of 49, and his second in 1961 at 52, and he died in his sleep on the 11th of March, 1963, at the age of 53, of a heart that had not been right since the third night in the cellar at the Rue Sablonnière. His daughter Marjorie was 14 years old. She is the woman who, in the spring of 1978, sat across from me at her kitchen table in Cadiz, Ohio, with her father's pencil drawings folded inside a Methodist hymnal, and let me copy them on a sheet of typing paper, and who told me, in the careful voice of a woman who had been told her father's story in pieces over many years, that the cellar in Belgium had been the one thing her father had talked about easily, because she said, when he talked about it, he had not had to talk about himself. Madame Renée Toussaint died in February of 1958, at the age of 81, of a quiet bronchitis in her own bed above the café on the Rue Sablonnière. The café was inherited by her great-niece, Mireille Lambert, who was 24 years old at the time and who had grown up in Liège, and who knew about the cellar only what her great-aunt had told her, which was a great deal. Mireille reopened the café in the spring of 1958 and ran it for 41 years. She closed it finally in the autumn of 1999, when her own knees would no longer carry her down the cellar stairs. The cellar is still there. I went to see it in the spring of 1978, in the second week of April, with the address Marjorie Vermilya, had written for me on the back of a Methodist church bulletin in Cadiz, Ohio. I walked from the railway station in Bastogne to the Rue Sablonnière in a slow rain. I found the café. The exterior had been repainted in 1961 in a pale yellow. The kitchen chimney, rebuilt after the war, was again standing where it had stood since 1761. I went in. Mireille Lambert, then in her early 40s, was working behind the bar. I gave her my name. I told her, in poor French and slow English, that I was an American retired engineer and that I had come to ask if I could see the cellar. She did not ask why. She wiped her hands on her apron, and she put a small, handwritten sign on the bar door that said in French, "Fermez 10 minutes." And she went and got the key from her kitchen drawer, and she opened the door to the stairs. The cellar was 14 feet 6 inches long. It was 11 feet 2 inches wide at the widest point. The 17th century oak beam was still in place across the center of the ceiling, still soft in the south third, still load-bearing in the north. The fieldstone walls were unchanged. The cheese shelf was still on the south wall. The wooden hatch over the potato pit was still in the floor. The 4-inch ventilation port that Hank Vermilya had cut into the ceiling on the night of the 20th of December 1944 was still there. It had been refitted in 1946 with a small cast-iron grate salvaged from the wreck of a Sherman tank at Mans Saint-Étienne, and the grate had a small fleur-de-lis embossed on it. In the southeast corner of the room, set into the fieldstone wall,